The night I lost my job, my mother did not offer me a hug. My father did not offer me advice. Instead, my younger sister screamed at the top of her lungs, demanding to know who was going to pay the $800 monthly loan for her luxury SUV. My father went upstairs, packed my bags, and told me to get out because my sister needed my bedroom for a home office. They threw me out into the cold street with nothing but a suitcase. I did not shed a single tear, and I did not argue. I simply walked out into the night. What my ungrateful family did not know was that the roof over their heads legally belonged to me. The $2 million asset they thought was theirs was entirely in my name, and their cruel decision that night was about to cost them absolutely everything. Before I continue this story, please let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe to the channel if you have ever had to cut off toxic family members who only loved you for what you could provide. Trust me, you will want to hear exactly how this revenge unfolds. My name is Sydney, and I am 29 years old. It was a Sunday evening, and the smell of my mother Brenda making her famous fried chicken and collard greens filled the house. For anyone looking through the front window, we looked like the perfect, successful African-American family. My father Calvin was a deacon at our church and obsessed with our family image. My 26-year-old sister Vanessa was the golden child who could do no wrong. We were all gathered in the living room after dinner. My hands were shaking slightly as I stood by the fireplace. I had just driven home from a mandatory weekend meeting where my corporate office announced massive layoffs. My position in the supply chain logistics department had been eliminated effective immediately. I took a deep breath, looking at the three people who were supposed to be my support system. I cleared my throat and told them the news. I explained that my department was shut down and I was officially out of a job. I expected at least a moment of shock or maybe a word of comfort. Instead, the room fell completely silent for about 5 seconds. Then Vanessa slammed her designer crystal glass onto the coffee table so hard I thought it would shatter. Her face twisted in pure anger as she stood up and pointed a manicured finger at me. She did not ask if I had a severance package. She did not ask how I was feeling. She yelled, asking how I could be so irresponsible. She demanded to know who was going to pay the $800 car note on her white Range Rover now that I was unemployed. I stared at her in absolute disbelief. I had been paying for her luxury vehicle for 2 years because she convinced our parents that she needed a safe car to match her social status. I looked toward my mother, Brenda, expecting her to scold Vanessa for being so incredibly selfish. Instead, my mother sighed heavily, rubbing her temples, as if I had just deeply inconvenienced her. Brenda looked at me with cold, disappointed eyes. She told me that Vanessa was right to be stressed out. My mother said that Vanessa and her husband Trent were going through a crucial time right now because Trent was launching his finance startup. She said I was incredibly selfish for dropping this kind of negative energy on the family on a Sunday night. My father Calvin stood up from his leather recliner and adjusted his expensive watch. He looked at me with the same disdain he had shown me since I was a teenager. He told me that this was exactly what happened when people were lazy. He said I spent too much time hiding behind a computer screen pretending to work while people like my sister and her husband were out in the world making real connections. He said my lack of ambition had finally caught up with me, and it was embarrassing for the family name. I wanted to scream. I wanted to laugh in his face. Trent was a 30-year-old unemployed man who spent his days pretending to be a cryptocurrency investor while secretly draining my sister of the allowance I gave her. But in my father's eyes, Trent was a financial genius simply because he dressed well and spoke with unearned confidence. Vanessa began to force fake tears down her cheeks, playing the victim perfectly. She cried to my parents, saying that her friends at the country club would laugh at her if her car was repossessed. She sobbed about how hard her life was and how I was intentionally trying to ruin her marriage by cutting off her financial support. My parents immediately rushed to her side. Brenda rubbed her back, whispering that everything would be okay and that they would not let me ruin her life. I stood entirely alone on the other side of the room watching this bizarre performance. Calvin turned back to me with a hard expression. He said that since I was no longer a contributing member of society, I had no right to take up the large guest bedroom upstairs. He told me that Vanessa and Trent needed that space to expand Trent's home office for his startup. My father pointed toward the front door and told me I had exactly 1 hour to go upstairs, pack my belongings, and get out of his house. He said the family did not have the resources to support a 29-year-old failure. The sheer audacity of his words echoed in my mind. His house. He called it his house. I looked at the imported rug, the expensive furniture, and the modern kitchen appliances. Every single item in this house had been paid for by my money. 4 years ago, when Calvin secretly gambled away his savings and faced foreclosure, I quietly created a limited liability company and bought the property from the bank to save them from public humiliation at the church. I allowed them to live here rent-free so they could keep their precious pride. And now they were kicking me out of my own property to make room for my sister's lazy husband. I did not argue. I did not tell them the truth. I simply nodded, turned around, and walked up the hardwood stairs to pack my bags. Every step I took felt lighter instead of heavier. The heavy burden of carrying this ungrateful family was finally lifting off my shoulders. I grabbed my suitcase and filled it with my clothes, my laptop, and my most important documents. I took a final look around the beautiful bedroom I had completely remodeled with my own hard-earned bonuses. The emotional betrayal was absolute and complete. They had actively prioritized my sister's fake luxury lifestyle over my basic survival and well-being. As I zipped up my suitcase, I realized I no longer felt any loyalty to these people. They had made their choice, choosing a shiny car and an imaginary finance startup over their own flesh and blood. I grabbed my phone and prepared to walk back downstairs. They wanted me out of their house. I was more than happy to oblige, because by tomorrow morning, this house would no longer be a safe haven for any of them. I walked back down the hardwood stairs carrying my suitcase, but my family was not finished with me yet. Trent was standing at the bottom of the stairs, blocking my path to the front door. He was wearing his signature fleece vest over a designer button-down shirt, a look funded entirely by the allowance I secretly gave my sister. Trent always loved playing the white savior in our black family. He enjoyed lecturing us about generational wealth and financial literacy while living rent-free under a roof he assumed my father owned. He crossed his arms over his chest and gave me a condescending smile that made my blood boil. He told me I needed to look at losing my job as a learning opportunity rather than a failure. He used buzzwords he had read on internet forums, telling me that corporate America was designed to keep people poor and that my lack of hustle was the reason I was the first one cut from the payroll. He actually said that people who just clock in and clock out do not bring real value to the marketplace. He suggested I read a few self-help books on the entrepreneurial mindset while I was looking for a new job. He patted me on the shoulder and said it was time for me to stop being lazy and start building a personal brand, just like he was doing with his cryptocurrency startup. I stared at him blankly. His fake startup had not generated a single dollar in 2 years, but my parents treated him like a Wall Street genius simply because of the confident way he spoke and the color of his skin. Before I could walk past him, my father Calvin stepped into the hallway. He was holding a large roll of heavy-duty black trash bags. He threw the roll onto the floor right at my feet. The heavy plastic hit the hardwood with a loud thud. Calvin pointed a stiff finger at my face and told me that one suitcase was not going to cut it. He said if Vanessa and Trent were going to use my room for a home office, they needed a completely blank slate. He ordered me to go back upstairs and bag up every single piece of clothing, every book, and every personal item I owned. He told me whatever was left in that room by midnight would be thrown out onto the driveway with the rest of the garbage. My own father looked at me with such deep contempt that it physically took my breath away. He was throwing me out into the street to make room for a man who contributed absolutely nothing to our family. Vanessa walked up behind Trent and peeked over his shoulder. She was scrolling through her phone, not even bothering to look me in the eye. She held out her hand with her palm facing up and snapped her fingers impatiently. She demanded the keys to the white Range Rover sitting in the driveway. She said since I was officially unemployed, I had no place to go and no need for a luxury vehicle. She whined to our parents saying it was basically her car anyway because she drove it to the country club and her brunch dates every weekend. She said it would be incredibly embarrassing for her reputation if she had to start taking an Uber or driving my father's old sedan. She told me to hand over the keys immediately before I left. The sheer audacity of her demand was staggering. The vehicle was legally registered to me. The auto loan was in my name. The insurance policy was in my name. I was the one who made the $800 payment on the first of every month so she could pretend to be a wealthy housewife. But I knew that arguing with them right now would only delay my ultimate plan. I reached into the front pocket of my jacket and pulled out the heavy silver key fob. I placed it right into Vanessa's open hand. She did not say thank you. She immediately turned around and started complaining to Trent about how my drama was ruining her Sunday evening. I bent down and picked up the roll of black trash bags. I walked back up the stairs while they went back into the living room to watch television. I moved methodically through my bedroom. I did not pack everything. I only packed the things that truly mattered to me. I left the expensive custom curtains I had purchased. I left the high-end mattress and the imported rug. I stuffed my remaining clothes into the black bags. The whole time I packed, nobody came upstairs to check on me. My mother did not come to ask where I would sleep. My father did not come to help me carry the heavy bags. I was completely invisible to them unless I was writing a check. An hour later, I dragged 3 heavy black trash bags and my suitcase down the stairs. Trent was standing by the front door again. He actually had the nerve to open the door for me, pretending to be a gentleman. He told me to keep my head up and suggested I look for a retail job at the mall to keep myself busy while I figured out my life. I walked past him without saying a single word. The cool night air hit my face as I dragged my belongings down the driveway. I stood on the sidewalk and looked back at the sprawling brick house. It looked so warm and inviting from the outside. I could see my family laughing through the large living room windows. They thought they had finally gotten rid of their lazy daughter. I pulled out my phone and requested a premium car to take me to a downtown hotel. Then I opened my messages and found the contact for my real estate attorney. Her name was Rachel, and she was the only person who knew the truth. I typed out a single sentence. Trigger Clause 4 and revoke all authorizations. I hit send. Clause 4 was a special provision in the operating agreement of Apex Holdings, the limited liability company I used to buy the house 4 years ago when my father secretly bankrupted the family. It immediately terminated any informal tenancy agreements. It also flagged my connected bank accounts, freezing the credit cards I allowed Vanessa to use. I got into the back seat of the black car that pulled up to the curb. The driver, an older gentleman with kind eyes, looked at me through the rearview mirror. He asked if I was all right and if I needed him to help with my bags. His simple kindness almost brought tears to my eyes because it was more compassion than my own family had shown me all night. I thanked him and told him I was perfectly fine. I protected their pride at the expense of my own peace for years. But tonight they proved that they did not deserve my protection. The message I sent to my lawyer was already in motion. The financial lifeline they had grown so accustomed to was officially severed. I watched my house disappear into the distance as we drove away. They had demanded the keys to the Range Rover, but they had no idea I was about to take the keys to their entire lives. The car rolled down the quiet suburban streets. I leaned my head against the cold glass of the window, watching the familiar neighborhood fade into the dark. My phone buzzed in my hand, breaking the silence. It was Rachel, my real estate attorney, calling me back less than 5 minutes after I sent the text message. I answered the call and held the phone to my ear. Rachel sounded wide awake despite the late hour. She asked me if I was absolutely sure I wanted to trigger Clause 4. I told her I had never been more sure of anything in my entire life. Rachel let out a heavy sigh through the receiver. She reminded me that triggering this specific clause in the Apex Holdings operating agreement would instantly freeze all supplementary credit accounts tied to the company trust. She also reminded me that it would legally terminate the $0 informal lease agreement I had established for my parents. I told Rachel that was exactly what I wanted. I explained that my father had just ordered me to pack my bags and vacate the premises so my sister and her unemployed white husband could have a larger home office. Rachel was silent for a few seconds. When she finally spoke, her voice was thick with disbelief. She asked if my father actually kicked me out of the very same house I bought at a foreclosure auction 4 years ago to save him from being homeless. I said yes, he did. I reminded Rachel how we scrambled to form the limited liability company in secret just days before the bank was scheduled to publicly seize the property due to his massive, hidden gambling debts. I had drained my own savings and leveraged my early tech career bonuses to buy the deed in cash. I did it all under the company name so my father Calvin could maintain his precious pride and his untouchable reputation at our church. I told Rachel they had no idea the house they were sitting in sat on a massive double lot that was recently rezoned for commercial use. I reminded her about the $2.7 million offer Apex Holdings received from a luxury commercial developer just last month. I had been holding off on signing the sale agreement because I did not want to displace my parents. I was willing to walk away from millions of dollars just to keep a roof over their heads. But tonight, they made the decision very easy for me. Rachel agreed and said she would prepare the final sale documents for my signature first thing in the morning. Rachel told me their behavior was the ultimate betrayal. She said she was logging into the banking portal right now to lock the platinum credit cards I had issued to Vanessa. I told Rachel to also prepare the 30-day notice to vacate and have it ready to serve to my parents. Rachel promised the legal paperwork would be ironclad. We ended the call, and I placed my phone on the leather seat next to me. The older driver cleared his throat softly. He kept his eyes on the dark road ahead, but spoke in a gentle, deep voice. He said he did not mean to eavesdrop, but he could not help hearing the conversation. He told me his name was Marcus, and he had seen a lot of things in his 60 years of life. He said he had seen families tear each other apart over money, but kicking the actual owner out of their own house was a whole new level of disrespect. I looked at Marcus through the rearview mirror and offered a tired smile. I told him I had spent my entire adult life trying to buy their love and approval. I explained how my sister Vanessa got everything she ever wanted while I was treated like an ATM machine that did not require any maintenance. Marcus nodded slowly as he turned the steering wheel. He told me that some people view kindness as a weakness to be exploited. He said my family had gotten so used to the privileges I quietly provided that they started believing they earned them on their own. He said the problem with building a comfortable safety net for ungrateful people is that they eventually forget who wove the net in the first place. His words hit me right in the chest because they were absolutely true. My parents and my sister genuinely believed their upper-middle-class lifestyle was a result of their own superiority. They had completely erased the memory of me bailing them out of financial ruin. They had convinced themselves that Trent was the real financial genius of the family, even though his crypto startup was a massive black hole of debt. I watched the city lights grow brighter as we approached the downtown district. I told Marcus that tonight was the last time they would ever disrespect me. I told him they demanded the keys to my Range Rover so my sister could drive to her fancy brunch tomorrow morning without feeling embarrassed. Marcus let out a deep chuckle that filled the quiet car. He asked me what she was going to do when she tried to pay for those expensive mimosas with a frozen credit card. I smiled genuinely for the first time all evening. I told him she was going to learn a very harsh lesson about financial independence. The black vehicle pulled up to the grand entrance of a luxury downtown hotel. The valet rushed forward to open my door. Marcus put the car in park and turned around to look at me directly. He told me to hold my head high and never look back at people who only loved my wallet. I thanked him for his wisdom and handed him a generous cash tip. I grabbed my suitcase and stepped out into the crisp night air. The hotel lobby was bright and smelled like fresh lilies. I walked up to the marble front desk and booked their best executive suite for the next 2 weeks. I handed the receptionist my heavy metal corporate card, the one attached to my actual software company that my family knew nothing about. The transaction was approved instantly. I took my room key and rode the glass elevator up to the top floor. When I entered the suite, I dropped my bags on the plush carpet. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows and looked out over the glowing city skyline. I felt an overwhelming sense of peace wash over my tired body. For the first time in years, I did not have to worry about paying someone else's bills. I did not have to listen to Trent make passive-aggressive comments about my work ethic. I did not have to watch my mother dote on Vanessa while ignoring my very existence. They thought they had discarded a failure tonight. They had no idea they had just cut the only lifeline keeping them from total financial collapse. I pulled down the heavy blackout curtains and climbed into the massive king-size bed. Tomorrow was going to be a very difficult day for Vanessa, and I intended to be fully rested for it. The morning sun poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my hotel suite, waking me up naturally for the first time in years. There was no alarm clock blaring. There was no sound of Vanessa complaining about the hot water running out. I stretched my arms and sank deeper into the plush white sheets. My phone was resting on the marble nightstand, and the screen lit up with a notification. It was a brief message from my lawyer, Rachel, confirming that the banking freeze was fully active across all secondary accounts. She also noted that the eviction papers were officially out for delivery. I smiled and ordered a massive room service breakfast, feeling completely unburdened. Meanwhile, across town, Vanessa was living in a completely different reality. It was 11 in the morning on a Monday. While most people were at work, my sister was sitting on the outdoor patio of an upscale French bistro. She always held court at this particular restaurant with her two best friends, who were just as entitled and image-obsessed as she was. I could picture the scene perfectly because I had paid for it hundreds of times. She would be wearing her oversized designer sunglasses, sipping a $20 mimosa, and picking at a plate of imported pastries. She would be bragging loudly to her friends about Trent and his imaginary finance startup, making sure the tables nearby could hear her. She loved to paint the picture of a wealthy young wife supported by a brilliant husband. The truth was about to crash down on her very publicly. My room service tray had just arrived with fresh coffee and eggs when my phone started ringing. The caller ID flashed Vanessa with a picture of her pouting at a camera. I took a slow sip of my hot coffee, letting it ring 3 times before I finally swiped to answer. I did not even get the chance to say hello before her shrill voice pierced through the speaker. She was absolutely hysterical, breathing heavily and speaking in a panicked whisper that she clearly wanted to keep hidden from her friends. She demanded to know what was wrong with my bank account. She said she just tried to pay the $300 bill for the table, and the waiter returned her platinum card, saying it was declined. She said the waiter announced it loudly enough for the entire patio to hear, and her friends were staring at her. She told me I needed to call the bank and fix the fraud alert immediately because I was embarrassing her. I leaned back against the headboard of my king-sized bed, balancing my coffee cup on my knee. I listened to her ramble about how disrespectful the restaurant staff was and how she was going to leave a terrible review. She never once considered that the money was actually gone. Her ego completely shielded her from the reality of her situation. She just assumed I forgot to transfer funds from my savings or that a security feature had tripped. She ordered me to transfer $500 to her digital wallet right that second so she could leave a big tip and save face. I let her finish her frantic demands. The silence on my end of the line forced her to stop talking. She asked if I was still there, and her voice was shaking with anger. I spoke very softly and evenly, making sure every word landed with perfect precision. I told her there was no fraud alert and no bank error. I reminded her that the platinum card in her hand was legally tied to my corporate trust account. I told her that since my father kicked me out of the house last night, I decided it was time to cut all unnecessary expenses. Vanessa gasped loudly into the phone. She started crying, but this time the tears were not fake. They were born out of pure panic. She begged me not to do this to her while she was out with her friends. She said she did not have another card to put the bill on, and her checking account only had $14 in it. She said her friends would think she was broke, and it would ruin her social standing at the country club. I felt absolutely no pity for her. I reminded her of the exact words she said to me less than 12 hours ago. I asked her how she could be so irresponsible to go to an expensive French bistro without having her own money. She tried to scream at me again, but I cut her off. I told her she was a married woman with a financial genius for a husband. I suggested she call Trent and have him dip into his massive cryptocurrency fortune to pay for her avocado toast and champagne. I told her I was unemployed, remember? Before she could scream another word, I pulled the phone away from my ear and ended the call. I immediately went into my settings and blocked her number. I set my phone down on the nightstand and took another bite of my breakfast. It was the most delicious meal I had ever tasted. I knew exactly what was happening at the bistro in that moment. Vanessa was staring at her blank phone screen, hyperventilating. She was going to have to walk back to her table and admit to her wealthy friends that her card was declined. She would probably try to lie and say the bank froze it for suspicious activity, but the humiliation would still be there. She would be forced to ask her friends to cover her portion of the bill, or she would have to call Trent to come rescue her. Either way, the perfect facade she had spent years building with my money was beginning to crack. Her ego would never allow her to accept that she was the problem. She would blame me. She would tell her friends that her jealous older sister was trying to ruin her life out of spite. She would run crying to our parents and they would feed into her delusion. They would comfort her and tell her I was just acting out because I was a failure. They would all gather around in the living room of my house, completely unaware that the real nightmare had not even begun yet. The credit card was just the first warning shot. I thought about my mother Brenda, and how she would react when Vanessa came home crying about the brunch disaster. Brenda would probably make a cup of tea and rub Vanessa on the shoulder, telling her that I was just going through a bitter phase. My father Calvin would sit in his leather chair and shake his head, talking about how ungrateful I was after everything they had done for me. They would reassure each other that kicking me out was the right decision. They would convince themselves that I would be back in a few days, begging for their forgiveness and offering to turn the credit cards back on. They genuinely believed they held all the power in our dynamic. They thought my love for them was a weakness they could exploit forever. They did not realize that the girl who used to cry in her bedroom begging for their affection was gone. The woman sitting in this hotel suite was a ruthless business owner who had just legally severed their main artery of survival. Vanessa having to beg her friends to pay for her brunch was a tiny inconvenience compared to what was coming next. I finished my coffee and walked over to the window, looking down at the busy city streets. I wondered if Trent was already on his way to pick up his stranded wife, and what kind of car he would be driving when he got there. I found out later exactly how the rest of that morning played out for my sister. The details were too juicy for her friends to keep secret, and within a few hours, the gossip had spread through our entire social circle. After I hung up on her, Vanessa had to walk back to her table with red eyes and a trembling lip. She sat down and forced a tight smile, trying to act as if nothing was wrong. When the waiter returned to the table, she had to clear her throat and tell her friends Morgan and Taylor that there was a security hold on her account. She lied through her teeth, saying Trent had been making large international wire transfers for his new crypto startup, and it flagged the bank's fraud department. It was a pathetic excuse, but her friends nodded politely while sipping their expensive drinks. Morgan ended up paying the entire bill, but the dynamic of the lunch had permanently shifted. Vanessa was no longer the wealthy center of attention. She was suddenly a charity case who could not afford to pay for her own breakfast. She rushed her friends out of the restaurant, wanting to escape the suffocating embarrassment of the patio. She just wanted to get into her luxury car and drive away so she could call Trent and scream at him in private. But as the three women stepped out onto the sunny sidewalk, a loud mechanical grinding noise echoed through the upscale parking lot. Vanessa stopped dead in her tracks, dropping her designer handbag right onto the concrete pavement. A large yellow tow truck was backed up directly to her pristine white Range Rover. The heavy metal hooks were already secured to the front axle, and the hydraulic lift was slowly raising the front wheels off the ground. Vanessa sprinted across the parking lot, screaming at the top of her lungs, making an absolute spectacle of herself. She yelled at the tow truck driver, telling him to put her car down immediately. She told him he was making a massive mistake and that her husband was going to sue the towing company into total bankruptcy. The driver was a large man wearing a neon safety vest, and he did not even flinch at her threats. He just kept operating the metal levers on the side of his truck, completely ignoring her aggressive tantrum. Vanessa tried to physically step between the tow truck and the Range Rover, crossing a dangerous line. That was exactly when two police officers stepped out from behind a nearby parked patrol car. I had specifically requested police presence when I called the asset recovery company, knowing exactly how volatile and entitled my sister could be when she did not get her way. The taller police officer held up his hand and sternly ordered Vanessa to step back onto the sidewalk away from the heavy machinery. She immediately tried to use her church status and her fake wealth to intimidate the officers. She pointed her perfectly manicured finger in the officer's face, screaming that they were violating her civil rights and allowing a criminal to steal her private property. The officer remained perfectly calm and professional. He pulled out a metal clipboard and asked for her identification. She practically spit her name at him, telling him she was Vanessa and that the luxury vehicle belonged exclusively to her. The officer looked down at his official paperwork and then looked back up at her. He spoke loudly enough for her two friends standing on the sidewalk to hear every single word of the painful truth. He told her the vehicle registration, the insurance policy, and the financing agreement were all legally in the name of Sydney. He said the legal owner had explicitly reported the vehicle as being operated by an unauthorized driver and had legally dispatched the recovery team to reclaim the asset. Vanessa turned completely pale. The blood drained from her face as the reality of the situation crashed into her ego. She stammered and stuttered, trying to say that I was her sister, and it was all just a big family misunderstanding. But the police officer shook his head, ending the conversation. He told her there was no misunderstanding because the legal owner had explicitly revoked her driving privileges earlier that morning. He warned her that if she continued to interfere with the legal recovery of the vehicle, he would place her in handcuffs and arrest her for disorderly conduct. Her two friends Morgan and Taylor stood on the sidewalk watching the entire pathetic scene unfold with wide eyes. They whispered to each other, covering their mouths to hide their shock and amusement. The grand illusion was completely shattered in broad daylight. They realized that Vanessa did not actually own the luxury car she loved to brag about every single weekend. They realized she was not a wealthy young wife supported by a highly successful finance husband. She was just a grown woman who relied entirely on her older sister to pay her bills, and now that sister had finally cut her off. The tow truck driver finished securing the thick yellow straps and climbed into the cab of his truck. The heavy diesel engine roared to life, and the truck slowly pulled out of the parking lot, dragging the beautiful white Range Rover behind it. Vanessa stood in the middle of the empty parking space, completely defeated. Her chest heaved as she watched her primary source of social status disappear down the busy street. She turned back to her friends, hoping for some sympathy or a ride home, but they suddenly looked very uncomfortable standing next to her. They made quick, awkward excuses about needing to get back to work and hurried toward their own cars, leaving Vanessa standing entirely alone in the restaurant parking lot. She pulled out her phone with shaking hands and called Trent, begging him to come get her. It took him almost 40 minutes to arrive, and when he finally did pull into the parking lot, it was the ultimate crowning moment of her social humiliation. Trent did not pull up in a sleek sports car or a luxury sedan. He arrived driving my father Calvin's old faded blue sedan, with a massive dent in the side door and a loud squeaky fan belt that echoed across the pavement. Vanessa had to endure the shame of climbing into the passenger seat of that loud, embarrassing car while the restaurant patrons and valets watched from the patio. The fake reality they had built their entire marriage on was collapsing in real time, right in front of the people they wanted to impress the most. They drove away in angry, suffocating silence, heading back to the house they thought was theirs, completely unaware that their nightmare was just getting started. The ride back to the house in the squeaky blue sedan was suffocating. Vanessa cried the entire way, complaining bitterly about how her friends looked at her when the tow truck pulled away. She wiped her smeared makeup and demanded that Trent fix the situation immediately. Trent gripped the steering wheel tightly, but he was not thinking about her ruined brunch. His mind was racing because his own financial lifeline had just been cut. The secret allowance I had been providing was gone, and the credit cards were dead. He needed a massive infusion of cash to keep up his fake lifestyle and fund his failing investments. He looked at his crying wife and realized her public humiliation was the perfect weapon to manipulate my parents. They pulled into the driveway, and Vanessa threw the car door open before the vehicle was even in park. She ran up the front steps and burst through the front door. My mother Brenda was sitting on the living room sofa drinking tea while my father Calvin watched a golf tournament on his large television. Vanessa threw herself onto the floor right at my mother's feet and began to wail loudly. Brenda immediately dropped her teacup and pulled Vanessa into her arms, asking who had hurt her. Trent walked through the door a few seconds later, wearing a carefully crafted expression of deep concern. Vanessa sobbed uncontrollably as she told them a completely twisted version of what happened at the restaurant. She did not tell them that her credit card was declined or that she could not pay her own bill. She claimed she was just trying to enjoy a quiet lunch when I maliciously sent the police to attack her and steal her car. She completely omitted the fact that I was the legal owner of the vehicle and had made every single payment on it for the last 2 years. She painted herself as the helpless victim of a deeply jealous and vindictive older sister. She cried into my mother's shoulder, saying I was trying to destroy her marriage and embarrass the family in front of their entire social circle. Brenda stroked Vanessa's hair and glared at the wall. She called me a monster and said I was dead to her. Calvin stood up from his leather chair, his face turning red with absolute rage. He paced back and forth across the expensive rug, talking about how he should have thrown me out of the house years ago. He said I was a toxic failure who could not stand to see my younger sister thriving. He ranted about how I was intentionally trying to ruin his good name in the church community. This was the exact moment Trent had been waiting for. He stepped forward and placed a comforting hand on Calvin's shoulder, playing the role of the protective son-in-law. He used his calmest and most authoritative voice. He told Calvin that they could not let me get away with this kind of disrespect. He said my actions were a direct attack on Calvin's authority as the head of the family. Trent said Vanessa deserved far better than to be bullied by a bitter sibling who had nothing going for her. Then Trent slowly introduced his master plan. He reminded Calvin that the beautiful house they were standing in was entirely paid off. He suggested that Calvin take out a home equity line of credit against the property to generate some immediate liquid capital. Trent used complicated financial buzzwords, making himself sound incredibly smart and successful. He told Calvin that wealthy people do not let their assets sit idle, they leverage them to create more wealth. Trent promised that if Calvin went to the bank and secured a loan for $300,000, they could solve all of their problems at once. He said he would take $50,000 and buy Vanessa a brand new luxury vehicle in cash. He promised it would be a nicer car than the one I took, and he would put the title exclusively in her name so I could never touch it again. The rest of the money he claimed would be injected directly into his proprietary cryptocurrency trading algorithm. Trent looked my father right in the eye and promised to double the money within 6 months. He said he would pay off the bank loan entirely and leave the family with a massive profit to secure their retirement. My father was completely blinded by his desire to maintain his wealthy image. He also had an absolute and unwavering trust in his white son-in-law, believing Trent was inherently smarter about money than anyone else in the family simply because of the confident way he spoke. Calvin agreed to the plan without a single moment of hesitation. He shook Trent's hand and called him a true visionary. Brenda smiled warmly and wiped the tears from Vanessa's cheeks. telling her she was going to get a beautiful new car by the end of the week. They all sat together in the living room celebrating their brilliant financial strategy. They were so blinded by their own greed and arrogance that they had no idea they were setting their own trap. They firmly believed they were taking control of their destiny and showing me that they did not need my help. They were completely unaware that they were planning to walk into a bank and try to borrow money against a house that legally belonged to me. Trent excused himself from the living room, leaving my family to comfort each other. He walked down the hall and stepped into my old bedroom, the space he was supposedly turning into a massive home office. The room was empty now except for the high-end mattress and custom curtains I had left behind. But Trent was not thinking about office furniture or business plans. He quickly locked the bedroom door behind him and pulled a burner phone out of his gym bag. His hands were shaking as he dialed a number he had memorized but never saved. The truth about Trent's crypto startup was far darker than just being a fake vanity project. He was not just losing money in the stock market, he had actively borrowed $50,000 from some very dangerous people to fund a shady offshore investment that completely vanished overnight. For the last 6 months, he had been using the secret allowance I gave Vanessa to pay the minimum monthly interest to keep these men from showing up at the house. But now that my corporate credit card was dead, his safety net was completely gone. The men he owed money to did not care about his fake financial genius persona. They only cared about cash, and they had given him until Friday to produce the full amount plus a massive penalty fee. The line rang twice before a deep, rough voice answered on the other end. Trent immediately dropped his confident tone and his voice cracked with pure desperation. He begged the man on the phone for just a few more days, promising that a huge influx of cash was coming. He swore on his life that his father-in-law was going to take out a massive home equity loan against a fully paid-off property. He promised to hand over $80,000 in untraceable cash by the end of the week. The man on the phone just laughed a cold, terrifying sound. He told Trent that if the money was not in his hands by Friday afternoon, he was going to come to the house and take it out of Trent's physical well-being. The line went dead, leaving Trent staring at the wall in a cold sweat. Trent took a few deep breaths to compose himself. He looked in the mirror, practicing his calm, authoritative smile. He needed to make sure Calvin moved as fast as possible to get that loan approved. He walked back into the living room where my parents were still hovering over Vanessa. Trent sat down heavily in an armchair, rubbing his forehead to look exhausted but determined. He looked at Calvin and said they needed to move aggressively. Trent started throwing around more financial jargon, talking about interest rates and liquidity traps. He told Calvin that because the housing market was shifting, they needed to lock in the home equity line of credit immediately before the banks tightened their lending criteria. He leaned forward and used the ultimate weapon against my father, his pride. Trent reminded Calvin that the annual church gala was coming up this weekend. He pointed out that if they did not have a new luxury car sitting in the driveway for Vanessa, the entire congregation would start asking questions. He painted a picture of the other deacons gossiping about Calvin's financial stability and questioning his leadership in the church. Calvin's posture stiffened immediately at the thought of losing face in front of his peers. His status as a wealthy deacon was the most important thing in his life. He looked at Trent and nodded vigorously, agreeing that they could not allow any rumors to start. Brenda chimed in, saying she refused to let her friends think our family was struggling just because I decided to act out. Trent assured them he had a contact at the local bank branch, a loan officer he had met at a networking event who owed him a favor. He claimed this connection could fast-track the loan approval and have the cash deposited into their accounts within 48 hours. It was a complete lie, of course. Trent had just Googled the nearest bank branch while he was in the bedroom, but he knew Calvin and Brenda would never question his methods. They were so desperate to believe in his success that they swallowed every single word he said. Calvin stood up and clapped Trent on the shoulder, thanking him for taking charge of the family in a time of crisis. He told Brenda to go upstairs and get his best suit ready because they were going to the bank the very next morning. Vanessa finally stopped crying and wiped her eyes, asking Trent if she could pick out the exact color of her new car. Trent smiled warmly and promised her she could have whatever she wanted. They all stood together in the living room, feeling victorious and unified. They were convinced they were outsmarting me, taking control of their financial destiny without needing my help. They did not realize that the house they were planning to borrow against was not an asset they owned, it was a ticking time bomb. They were actively building a house of cards on a foundation of my property, and they were about to hand the detonator directly to a bank officer who had a legal obligation to verify the deed. I was sitting in my luxury hotel room miles away, completely unaware of their plan, but knowing perfectly well that the trap they were setting would only snap back on them. The next morning, my family woke up with a renewed sense of arrogant purpose. It was Tuesday, but they dressed as if it was Easter Sunday. Calvin put on his custom-tailored navy blue suit, the one he usually reserved for speaking at the church podium. He polished his leather dress shoes until they mirrored his inflated ego. Brenda spent 2 hours applying her makeup and styling her hair, wearing a silk dress and her favorite pearl necklace. She wanted to make sure every teller in the building knew she was a woman of high social standing. Vanessa, despite having her luxury vehicle repossessed less than 24 hours ago, managed to find a designer handbag and a pair of oversized sunglasses to complete her wealthy housewife costume. Trent wore his typical finance uniform, consisting of a crisp white button-down shirt and a dark fleece vest, hoping to look like a young venture capitalist. They piled into my father's old squeaky blue sedan. The ride to the bank was filled with excited chatter about how they were going to spend the money. Vanessa was already browsing car dealership websites on her phone, picking out the exact interior features she wanted for her new luxury SUV. Trent was sitting in the front seat nodding along, while secretly calculating how fast he could wire the $80,000 to his loan sharks before his Friday deadline. Calvin was driving with a smug smile on his face, completely convinced that he was the brilliant patriarch leading his family to generational wealth. They arrived at the largest downtown branch of the premier national bank. Calvin parked the old sedan far away from the entrance, hoping nobody would see them get out of it. They walked through the heavy glass double doors of the bank in a tight formation, like royalty entering a throne room. Calvin immediately bypassed the regular line of customers waiting for the tellers. He walked directly up to the main reception desk, where a young female employee was typing on her computer. He cleared his throat loudly, demanding her immediate attention. He did not ask for an appointment, he simply announced that Deacon Calvin and his family were here to secure a massive home equity line of credit, and they needed to speak to a senior loan officer right this second. The receptionist blinked in surprise at his demanding tone. She politely asked if they had scheduled a meeting. Trent stepped forward, leaning his elbow on the marble counter, trying to use his white privilege to intimidate the young worker. He flashed a condescending smile and told her that high-net-worth clients do not need to wait in line. He claimed he had a personal relationship with the regional director and strongly suggested she find an executive loan officer before she lost her job. The receptionist, clearly uncomfortable, picked up her desk phone and made a hushed call. A few minutes later, a sharply dressed man in his late 40s walked out of a glass corner office. His name badge read, Mr. Evans, Senior Loan Director. He extended his hand to Calvin, introducing himself and apologizing for the wait. Calvin shook his hand firmly, puffing out his chest. He introduced Trent as his son-in-law and primary financial advisor, making sure to emphasize the word advisor. Mr. Evans gestured for the four of them to follow him back to his private office. The glass-enclosed office was exactly the kind of environment my father felt he deserved. He took the most comfortable leather chair across from the heavy mahogany desk. Brenda sat next to him, crossing her legs elegantly. Trent and Vanessa took the remaining 2 chairs. Mr. Evans sat behind his computer, offering them bottled water, which they all declined. He asked how he could assist the family with their financial goals today. Trent immediately took control of the conversation. He leaned forward, intertwining his fingers, resting his elbows on his knees. He began using a ridiculous amount of financial jargon that made absolutely no sense in the context of a simple home equity loan. He talked about leveraging stagnant real estate assets to maximize crypto liquidity and hedging against traditional market inflation. He spoke incredibly fast, hoping to confuse Mr. Evans into just agreeing with him. Trent proudly announced that they needed a $300,000 line of credit drawn against Calvin's primary residence to fund a proprietary investment vehicle. Mr. Evans nodded slowly, typing information into his computer. He looked over his glasses at Calvin and asked for the exact property address to begin the preliminary appraisal process. Calvin smiled broadly, reciting the address of the large brick colonial house he thought he owned. He sat back in his chair and began to boast. He told the loan officer that the house was sitting on a massive double lot in the most exclusive neighborhood in the city. He proudly declared that the property was completely paid off and did not have a single cent of debt attached to it. He talked about how he had maintained the house perfectly and how he was a respected pillar of the church community. Brenda chimed in, adding that they had recently completely remodeled the upstairs guest bedroom, making it a state-of-the-art home office for Trent. She intentionally left out the part where they threw their own daughter out onto the street to make that happen. Vanessa checked her reflection in her phone screen, acting incredibly bored by the whole process. She assumed this was just a simple formality, and that they would be walking out with a check in 10 minutes. Calvin folded his hands over his stomach and gave Mr. Evans a patronizing look. He told the loan officer that they were in a bit of a rush today. He said they had car shopping to do and important investments to finalize. He demanded that Mr. Evans expedite the approval process and wire the funds directly into Trent's business account by the next morning. They all sat there basking in their own manufactured glory. They felt powerful and untouchable. They had completely written me out of their lives and were happily moving forward with their master plan. They smiled at the loan officer, waiting for him to praise their financial brilliance and hand over the money. Mr. Evans turned his attention back to his dual computer monitors. He typed the address of the house into the bank secure property database. The small glass office was quiet except for the sound of his keyboard clicking. My family sat back in their leather chairs, exchanging confident smiles. They fully expected him to turn around and congratulate them on their massive real estate equity. But as the database loaded, the professional smile on Mr. Evans' face slowly disappeared. He leaned closer to the screen, squinting his eyes as if he was misreading the text. He clicked his mouse a few more times, pulling up the official county tax records to verify what the internal bank system was telling him. Calvin noticed the sudden shift in the loan officer's demeanor. He sat forward, adjusting his custom-tailored suit jacket, and asked if there was a problem with the internet connection. He chuckled nervously, saying that sometimes these computer systems can be a bit slow to register high-value assets for wealthy clients. Mr. Evans did not laugh. He took a deep breath and slowly took off his reading glasses. He looked directly at my father with a mixture of professional confusion and deep pity. He slowly turned his heavy computer monitor around so it was facing my family. He pointed his pen to the highlighted section of the official property deed. He told my father that there must be some sort of massive misunderstanding. He said, "Mr. Calvin, you cannot take out a home equity loan against this property." He explained in a very calm and clear voice that according to the Federal Registry, Calvin was not the legal owner of the house and had not been the owner for over 4 years. The air in the glass office became incredibly thick and suffocating. Calvin let out a loud, forced laugh, slapping his knee, trying to brush it off as a simple clerical error. He told Mr. Evans that the computer was broken. He loudly declared that he bought that house 20 years ago and paid off the mortgage with his own hard-earned money. He demanded that Mr. Evans refresh the page, call the technical support department, and stop playing games with his time. But Mr. Evans remained completely serious. He did not touch the keyboard. Instead, he pulled up a second document on the screen and enlarged the text. It was the public foreclosure record from 4 years ago. Mr. Evans read the legal document aloud to the entire room. He stated that the property had been seized by the primary mortgage lender due to severe loan default and massive unpaid debts. He went on to explain that the house was immediately purchased at a private foreclosure auction by a commercial real estate firm called Apex Holdings. Mr. Evans looked Calvin right in the eye and delivered the final crushing blow. He told my father that he and his family were merely listed as $0 tenants, living on the property under an informal verbal lease agreement. He said they had absolutely no equity, no ownership, and no legal right to use the property as collateral for any type of financial loan. The silence that followed was deafening. It was the kind of silence that rings in your ears. My mother's jaw dropped open, and she stared at the glowing computer screen, unable to process the words she was hearing. She looked at Calvin, her eyes wide with absolute panic and betrayal. Brenda had spent the last 4 years bragging to the women at the church about her beautiful paid-off home. She had hosted countless Bible study groups and Sunday dinners, acting superior to everyone else because she thought they owned the largest house in the neighborhood. Now she was sitting in a bank office, finding out that her husband had secretly lost their home to foreclosure, and they were basically living as charity cases. Brenda grabbed Calvin's arm and demanded to know what the loan officer was talking about. She asked him if he had lied to her about paying off the house. Calvin turned completely pale. His chest was heaving as he stared at the words, Apex Holdings, on the screen. He knew exactly what had happened 4 years ago, but he had buried the memory so deep in his massive ego that he almost believed his own lies. He knew he had secretly gambled away their mortgage money, and he knew I had stepped in to save them. But he never knew the name of the legal entity I used to buy the house. He just assumed I paid off his debt and put the house back in his name because he felt entitled to my money. Trent sat completely frozen in his chair. The color drained from his face, as the brutal reality of the situation hit him like a freight train. He did not care about my parents' pride or their embarrassing living situation. He only cared about the $300,000 he desperately needed to survive. Without the house, there was no collateral. Without collateral, there was no bank loan. And without the bank loan, he was going to have to face the dangerous men who promised to break his legs on Friday afternoon. He started breathing heavily, pulling at the tight collar of his expensive white shirt. His fake venture capitalist persona melted away, leaving behind a terrified man who owed a massive debt to the wrong people. Vanessa simply looked annoyed by the delay. She crossed her arms over her chest and asked Trent what all of this meant. She whined that they were wasting time and asked when they were going to leave to go to the luxury car dealership. She was completely oblivious to the fact that her entire reality was crumbling around her. She did not understand what foreclosure or $0 tenants meant. She just wanted her new white luxury vehicle, and she wanted it today. Calvin slammed his heavy fist down on the mahogany desk, rattling the pens and the complimentary water bottles. He shouted at Mr. Evans, calling him a liar and a terrible bank employee. He said the bank was trying to steal his land, and that he was going to call his powerful lawyers to sue the entire branch. He tried to maintain his authoritative deacon persona, but his voice was shaking uncontrollably. The strong, wealthy patriarch image he had spent his entire life building was instantly shattered into a million tiny pieces. He was a complete fraud, and now his wife, his daughter, and his precious son-in-law knew it. He had absolutely nothing left to hide behind. Mr. Evans did not argue with my father. He sat patiently behind his desk, watching Calvin scream and point his finger. The loan officer had seen people react to financial ruin before, but this was an entirely new level of delusion. As Calvin continued his unhinged rant about calling his lawyers, a small machine on the corner of the mahogany desk began to beep. It was the private office fax machine directly connected to the bank's legal and compliance department. The machine hummed and pulled a crisp white piece of paper through its rollers. Mr. Evans held up his hand, asking Calvin to calm down for just one moment. He reached over and pulled the fresh document from the tray. He scanned the text quickly and his eyes widened slightly in surprise. He looked from the paper to my father and then back to the paper. He told Calvin that because the bank had initiated a hard credit inquiry and a formal title search on a commercial property, it automatically triggered a notification to the legal entity that owned the deed. Mr. Evans said that the legal representatives for Apex Holdings had just faxed over an urgent document specifically addressed to the current occupants of the house. Calvin stopped yelling. He breathed heavily, his chest rising and falling as he stared at the piece of paper in the loan officer's hand. He demanded that Mr. Evans hand it over immediately, claiming it was probably just a clerical apology from the real owners. Mr. Evans slid the single piece of paper across the smooth wooden desk. Calvin snatched it up aggressively. Brenda leaned over his shoulder, her pearl necklace clinking against the desk so she could read it at the same time. Trent leaned forward in his chair, completely terrified of what the document might say. Vanessa was still looking at her phone, completely detached from the devastating reality unfolding around her. The document was printed on heavy official letterhead. It was a formal, certified 30-day notice to vacate the premises. It stated in absolute, explicit legal terms that the $0 informal tenancy agreement was officially terminated effective immediately. It explicitly demanded that all current occupants remove their personal belongings and vacate the property entirely within 30 days or face immediate forceful eviction by the county sheriff's department. It also stated that the property was in the final stages of a multi-million-dollar commercial sale, and any damage to the fixtures would result in severe civil lawsuits against the occupants. Brenda let out a sharp gasp, covering her mouth with her hands. The reality of becoming homeless hit her wealthy housewife persona like a physical blow. But Calvin was not looking at the eviction terms. His eyes were glued to the bottom of the page, where a bold black signature authorized the entire document. He stared at the name printed underneath the signature line. His hands began to shake so violently that the paper rattled in the quiet office. He blinked several times, trying to convince himself that he was hallucinating. He read the name out loud, his voice cracking and trembling. Sydney, Chief Executive Officer of Apex Holdings. The name hung in the air like a poisonous cloud. For a few seconds, nobody breathed. Then Brenda snatched the paper out of his hands and stared at the signature herself. She let out a horrifying wail of absolute despair. She finally understood the magnitude of her mistake. The lazy daughter she had just thrown out into the street was actually a multi-million-dollar real estate owner. The daughter she constantly belittled was the only reason she had not been living in a tiny apartment for the last 4 years. She realized with crushing certainty that I was the phantom landlord who had allowed them to live their fake luxurious lifestyle, and now I was pulling the plug completely. Calvin's face turned a dangerous shade of purple. The shock quickly morphed into a violent, uncontrollable rage. He crumpled the paper in his fist and threw it at Mr. Evans. He started screaming at the top of his lungs, acting like a complete madman. He shouted that I was an evil, ungrateful child who had stolen his property through deception. He refused to accept that I had actually saved him from his own gambling bankruptcy. His massive ego twisted the truth, convincing him that I had somehow tricked the bank and stolen his legacy. He stood up and kicked the leather chair, sending it crashing into the glass wall of the office. Trent sat frozen in absolute horror. The realization washed over him completely. I was not just a corporate employee who got laid off. I was the silent financial force behind the entire family. He finally understood why Vanessa always had money and why the credit cards were suddenly frozen. He realized I was the one funding his fake venture capitalist lifestyle all along. And now he was sitting in a bank with zero collateral, a useless father-in-law, and a Friday deadline with violent loan sharks. His breathing became shallow and rapid as a full-blown panic attack set in. He gripped the armrests of his chair, staring blankly at the floor, knowing his life was essentially over. Vanessa finally looked up from her phone, startled by the sound of the chair hitting the glass. She looked at her screaming father and her crying mother. She frowned in confusion and asked if this meant she was not getting her new Range Rover today. She complained that her friends were expecting to see her in a new luxury car by tomorrow. Her total lack of awareness in the face of complete family destruction was absolutely staggering. She did not understand that she was 30 days away from living on the street. The commotion in the office was so loud that Mr. Evans had to press the silent alarm button under his desk. Two large security guards dressed in dark uniforms quickly entered the glass office. They sternly ordered Calvin to step away from the desk and instructed the entire family to leave the premises immediately. Calvin tried to argue, pointing his finger at the guards and threatening to have them fired, but they simply grabbed him by the arms and physically escorted him out of the room. Brenda followed behind them, sobbing uncontrollably, her silk dress and pearl necklace now looking completely ridiculous against her tear-stained face. Trent grabbed Vanessa by the arm and pulled her out of the chair, practically dragging her out of the bank. They were paraded through the main lobby in front of dozens of staring customers and bank tellers. The powerful, wealthy deacon and his perfect family were publicly humiliated, thrown out of the building like common criminals. They walked out into the bright sunlight completely broken. They had to endure the agonizing walk of shame all the way back to the far end of the parking lot where Calvin's old blue sedan was waiting for them. The grand illusion was dead, and they were finally forced to face the reality I had shielded them from for years. The drive back from the bank was completely silent for the first 10 minutes. The heavy, suffocating reality of their situation pressed down on all of them. Calvin gripped the steering wheel so tightly, his knuckles turned white. He refused to look at his wife or his daughter. He was completely consumed by a toxic mixture of humiliation and blinding rage. Brenda stared out the passenger window, her face stained with ruined makeup. She was already calculating how fast the gossip would spread if the bank tellers told anyone in their social circle about the eviction notice. In the back seat, Trent was practically vibrating with anxiety. He pulled out his burner phone and stared at the blank screen, knowing the dangerous men he owed money to were waiting for an update he did not have. Vanessa just sulked with her arms crossed, complaining that the seats in the old sedan smelled like dust. When they finally pulled into the driveway of the house they no longer owned, Calvin slammed the car into park and marched inside. He did not go to his leather recliner to sulk. He went straight to his mahogany dining table and slammed his fist down against the polished wood. He loudly declared that he was not going to let a disrespectful child steal his legacy. His massive ego simply could not process the fact that I was the rightful owner of the property. In his twisted mind, I had somehow manipulated the legal system to rob him of his hard-earned wealth. He told Brenda that they were not packing a single box. He said they were going to fight back and put me in my place once and for all. Brenda walked into the dining room, dabbing her eyes with a tissue. She reminded Calvin that the law was not on their side. She said the eviction notice was legally binding, and the bank had already confirmed I was the chief executive officer of the commercial real estate firm. But Calvin shook his head violently. He said the law did not matter when you had the moral high ground. He turned to Brenda and reminded her about the annual church gala happening this coming Saturday. It was the biggest social event of the year for their congregation. Calvin was scheduled to give the opening prayer, and Brenda was the head of the hospitality committee. Calvin's eyes lit up with a dark, manipulative energy. He told his family that I had always been weak when it came to public opinion. He reminded them how much I craved their approval and how much I respected the church elders. He said they were going to use the gala as the ultimate trap. His plan was incredibly sinister and relied entirely on emotional blackmail. He decided they would invite me to the gala, pretending they wanted to publicly apologize and reconcile as a family. They would give me a seat of honor at the front table, right next to Pastor Thomas, to make me feel important. Trent leaned against the dining room wall, listening intently. His desperate mind clung to Calvin's plan like a life raft. He asked Calvin how an apology was going to get him the $300,000 he needed by Friday afternoon. Calvin smiled a cold, calculating smile. He said the apology was just the bait. He planned to wait until the main dinner was served and the entire congregation of 500 people was seated and listening. Then Calvin would take the microphone and play the ultimate victim. He would tell the entire church that I had secretly bought the house out from under them and was now trying to evict my aging parents to make a quick profit. Brenda gasped slightly, but then a wicked smile spread across her face. She completely understood the assignment. She knew the church community valued honoring your mother and father above almost everything else. If Calvin exposed my supposed cruelty in front of the pastor and all the deacons, the social pressure would be absolutely crushing. Calvin planned to have his lawyer draft a simple quitclaim deed, transferring the property from Apex Holdings back into his personal name. He intended to place the legal document on the table right in front of me, while the entire church watched, waiting for me to prove my Christian charity and sign the house over to them to save their lives. They all agreed it was a foolproof plan. They genuinely believed I would crumble under the weight of 500 disappointed stares. They thought the threat of being excommunicated and shunned by the community would terrify me into giving up my $2 million asset. Vanessa clapped her hands together excitedly, thinking this meant she would still get her luxury vehicle next week. Trent let out a massive sigh of relief, thinking he could stall his loan sharks until Monday, once the house was secured in Calvin's name. Since I had blocked all of their phone numbers, Brenda had to find another way to deliver the trap. She sat down at her computer and typed out a long emotional email to my personal address. She filled the message with heavy religious guilt and fake tears. She wrote that the family was devastated by the misunderstanding at the bank. She claimed that Calvin had suffered a minor health scare from the stress, and they realized that family was more important than pride. She begged me to attend the annual church gala on Saturday night, saying they had reserved a special seat for me. She promised that if I came, they would make everything right and publicly acknowledge my success. I was sitting on the velvet sofa in my downtown hotel suite when the email notification popped up on my laptop. I read through my mother's dramatic words and actually laughed out loud in the empty room. The manipulation was so blatant and desperate, it was almost insulting to my intelligence. I knew exactly what they were trying to do. They wanted to drag me into their territory where they held all the social power. They wanted to use the pastor and the congregation as weapons to force me into submission. I sat back and stared at the glowing city skyline outside my window. A part of me wanted to simply ignore the email and let the 30-day eviction clock run out. But another part of me, the part that had spent 29 years being silenced and pushed aside, knew that simply walking away was not enough. They needed to be exposed completely and permanently. If they wanted to use the church gala to put on a public performance, I was more than happy to oblige them. I replied to my mother's email with a single sentence confirming my attendance. Then I opened my desk drawer and pulled out a small silver flash drive. I began loading it with every single piece of financial evidence I had collected over the years, preparing to give my family exactly the kind of public attention they were begging for. Saturday night arrived with a cool evening breeze. The downtown Plaza Hotel Grand Ballroom had been completely transformed for the annual Fellowship Gala. This was not just a simple dinner, it was the single most important social event of the year for our church community. It was a night where status was loudly displayed through extravagant designer dresses, custom-tailored tuxedos, and the size of the donation checks handed over to the church elders. A live band was playing smooth gospel jazz in the corner of the room, and massive crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over the 50 round tables, covered in pristine white linen and expensive floral centerpieces. My parents had arrived early to make sure they were seen by everyone who mattered. They had secured table number 1, right next to the elevated stage where Pastor Thomas and his wife were seated. Calvin was wearing a brand new black tuxedo that he definitely could not afford. Brenda was draped in a heavy emerald velvet gown and wearing her signature pearl necklace, putting on a massive fake smile for anyone who walked past their table. Vanessa was sitting next to her mother wearing a tight sequined dress and looking completely miserable because she had been forced to take a public rideshare to the hotel instead of arriving in her luxury SUV. Trent sat next to Vanessa, looking completely rigid and unwell. His face was pale and he was sweating profusely. He had officially missed his Friday afternoon deadline with the loan sharks. He knew he was completely out of time, and his only hope for physical safety was my father successfully bullying me into signing over the house tonight. I arrived at the hotel a full hour after the doors opened, intentionally waiting until the ballroom was packed. I stepped out of my premium black car and walked through the grand lobby. I was not wearing the clothes of a defeated unemployed woman. I wore a stunning, floor-length, deep ruby red designer gown that hugged my figure perfectly and pooled elegantly at my feet. My hair was professionally styled into soft waves, and I wore a pair of diamond drop earrings that caught the light with every confident step I took. In my small, elegant clutch, I carried my favorite dark lipstick and the silver flash drive that held my family's complete destruction. When the heavy wooden doors of the ballroom swung open for me, the atmosphere in the room shifted almost instantly. I walked down the main aisle toward the front of the room with my head held high and my shoulders pulled back. I moved with the quiet, unbothered confidence of a woman who completely owned her reality. As I glided past the tables, the smooth jazz music seemed to fade into the background. The low murmur of polite dinner conversation was quickly replaced by loud whispers and turning heads. In our church community, gossip traveled faster than the speed of light. I knew that my mother had likely spent the last few days planting seeds of deception. She had probably told her prayer circle that I was going through a severe mental breakdown, or that I had become dangerously rebellious against the family. The congregation fully expected me to walk in looking ashamed and desperate for my parents' grace. Instead, I looked like a multi-million-dollar chief executive officer. I saw older women leaning across the tables, whispering behind their manicured hands as I passed. I saw the deacons nudging each other and pointing discreetly in my direction. I finally reached table number 1. My family was sitting together looking like a perfectly painted portrait of traditional values. But as I stopped at the empty chair they had reserved for me, the illusion cracked. Calvin gripped the edge of the table so tightly, his knuckles turned completely white. He stared at my expensive gown with a look of pure, unadulterated hatred. He hated that I did not look broken. He hated that I was not cowering in fear. Brenda quickly plastered a fake maternal smile on her face, but her eyes were cold and calculating. She leaned across the table and told me in a hushed, aggressive whisper that she was so glad I decided to stop running and face my mistakes. She told me to sit down and keep my mouth shut until the pastor finished his opening remarks. I did not respond to her condescending greeting. I simply pulled out my chair and sat down, crossing my legs elegantly. I looked directly across the table at Trent. He was tapping his foot nervously against the carpet, and his eyes darted around the room as if he expected the men he owed money to walk through the ballroom doors at any second. He looked absolutely terrified of his own shadow. I offered him a small knowing smile, and he quickly looked down at his empty dinner plate, unable to hold my gaze for even a second. Vanessa glared at my diamond earrings and rolled her eyes, muttering under her breath about how I was always trying to show off and ruin her night. The tension at our table was absolutely suffocating. It was a thick, heavy silence that felt exactly like the calm right before a massive hurricane makes landfall. Surrounding us, hundreds of people were laughing, taking pictures, and enjoying their elegant evening, completely unaware of the absolute war that was about to unfold at table number 1. Waiters in crisp white shirts began moving silently through the room, pouring ice water and serving the first course of the meal. The clinking of heavy silver forks against expensive china echoed through the room. I took a slow sip from my crystal water glass, scanning the faces of the church elders seated at the adjacent tables. These were the men and women who had watched me grow up. They were the same people who had constantly praised Vanessa while completely ignoring my academic and professional achievements. They were the audience my father had specifically chosen to witness my public humiliation. Calvin leaned over and whispered a harsh threat under his breath, telling me that I better sign the paperwork he brought, or he would make sure I was dead to everyone in this room. I just kept my eyes on the stage. Pastor Thomas approached the wooden podium, tapping the microphone to get everyone's attention. The ballroom immediately went quiet. He began his opening prayer speaking in a booming, charismatic voice about the importance of family unity, respect, and deep forgiveness. I watched my father close his eyes and nod along to the pastor's words, looking like the most devout, holy man in the room. Calvin was mentally preparing for his big performance. He was just waiting for the perfect moment to stand up take the microphone and play the ultimate victim in front of his peers. He truly thought he had me perfectly trapped in a corner with no way out. He had no idea that I was just sitting there patiently waiting for him to hand me the microphone so I could burn his entire fake kingdom to the ground. Pastor Thomas finished his opening prayer to a chorus of amens echoing through the grand ballroom. He smiled warmly and announced that he wanted to invite Deacon Calvin and his wonderful wife Brenda to the stage. He said they wanted to share a special testimony about the trials and triumphs of family love. The congregation clapped politely as my parents stood up from table number 1. Calvin adjusted his expensive tuxedo jacket and placed a supportive hand on my mother's back, guiding her up the short wooden stairs to the elevated stage. I sat perfectly still, taking a slow sip of my ice water. Brenda stepped up to the wooden podium and adjusted the microphone. She looked out over the sea of 500 faces and let out a heavy, trembling sigh. It was a masterclass in theatrical manipulation. She blinked rapidly, forcing genuine-looking tears to well up in her eyes and spill over her meticulously powdered cheeks. The ballroom fell completely silent. Every single person was hanging on to her every breath, waiting to hear what tragedy had struck the beloved deacon and his family. Brenda began to speak in a fragile, broken voice. She told the church that her family was going through a period of unimaginable darkness and spiritual warfare. She sniffled and dabbed her eyes with a white tissue. She said that for 29 years, she and Calvin had poured every ounce of their love and resources into raising 2 beautiful daughters. She talked about how they had always tried to lead by Christian example, teaching their children the values of charity and selflessness. Then she slowly turned her head and pointed a shaking finger directly at me. The spotlight seemed to follow her gesture, illuminating me in my red designer gown. Brenda sobbed into the microphone, telling the entire congregation that I had allowed greed and jealousy to completely corrupt my soul. She claimed that I had secretly created a malicious shell company to manipulate the legal system and steal the deed to the family home. She wailed loudly, saying that I had tricked my aging father when he was vulnerable and robbed him of his lifelong legacy. The reaction in the ballroom was instantaneous and visceral. Loud gasps erupted from the tables around me. I could hear older women murmuring prayers of protection and men whispering in absolute shock. Brenda did not stop there. She leaned closer to the microphone and painted a picture of pure cruelty. She told everyone that I was not just satisfied with stealing the property, but that I had officially served them with eviction papers. She cried that I was trying to throw my own parents and my innocent sister Vanessa out onto the cold street just to make a quick profit from a commercial real estate developer. She painted Vanessa as a helpless victim, claiming I had already maliciously repossessed her only mode of transportation out of pure spite. She begged the congregation to pray for my soul because she did not recognize the monster her eldest daughter had become. The public villainization was absolute and devastating. I was no longer a member of their community. In the eyes of the 500 people staring at me, I was a greedy, vindictive traitor who was destroying a holy family. The heavy stares from the surrounding tables felt like physical weights pressing down on my shoulders. People I had known since Sunday school were glaring at me with open disgust. A few women at the next table actually shifted their chairs to face away from me, as if my presence was a contagious disease. My mother stepped back from the podium, burying her face in Calvin's shoulder, while he wrapped his arms around her, playing the role of the stoic, heartbroken patriarch. It was exactly the kind of public guilt trip Calvin had designed to completely break my spirit. That was when Trent decided to make his move. He saw the crowd turning against me and felt a sudden surge of unearned confidence. He stood up from table number 1 and walked around to my side of the table. He stood directly behind my chair, looming over me to use his physical size as a weapon of intimidation. He grabbed a wireless microphone from the center of the table and turned it on. His voice echoed through the massive speakers, amplifying his condescending tone. Trent told the congregation that as the man of the house, he had tried everything to reason with me privately. He lied through his teeth, saying he had offered to pay me whatever money I thought I was owed, just to keep the family together. He looked down at me, his face tight with anger, and lectured me about Christian charity. He used words like forgiveness duty and moral obligation. He said that a true Christian would never prioritize a real estate payout over the safety and security of their own flesh and blood. He reached inside his dark fleece vest and pulled out a folded legal document. It was the quitclaim deed Calvin had his lawyer draft earlier that week. Trent slapped the heavy paper down onto the white tablecloth right next to my dinner plate. He placed a silver pen on top of it. He leaned down so his face was only inches from mine. His breath smelled like stale coffee and pure panic. He told me through gritted teeth that I had one chance to make things right in the eyes of God and the community. He ordered me to sign the deed and transfer the house back to my father immediately. The entire ballroom held its collective breath. 500 pairs of eyes were locked onto me, waiting to see if I would crumble under the immense pressure. They fully expected me to burst into tears, pick up the pen, and sign my $2 million asset away just to escape the unbearable public shame. Calvin and Brenda stood on the stage looking down at me with victorious smirks hidden beneath their sorrowful expressions. Vanessa was actually smiling now, assuming the battle was already won. Trent stood over my shoulder, breathing heavily, waiting for me to surrender. I looked down at the legal document resting on the pristine white tablecloth. I looked at the silver pen. Then I slowly lifted my head and looked around the massive ballroom. I saw the judgment, the disgust, and the absolute certainty in their faces. They truly believed the false narrative my parents had spun. They thought they had successfully backed me into a corner where my only option was total submission. I felt a slow, calm smile spread across my face. I did not reach for the pen. Instead, I reached into my small, elegant clutch and wrapped my fingers around the silver flash drive. The time for sitting quietly and protecting their fragile pride was officially over. I stood up slowly from my chair, pushing it back against the thick carpet. I did not look at the heavy legal document Trent had slammed onto the table, and I certainly did not touch the silver pen. I looked Trent right in the eye and watched his confident smirk falter just a little bit. Then I turned my back to table number 1 and began walking down the center aisle of the ballroom. The entire congregation let out a collective breath, thinking they had just witnessed my total surrender. They assumed I was overwhelmed by the public shame and was simply running away from the ballroom in tears. I could hear my mother Brenda letting out a loud theatrical sigh of relief into her microphone. She probably thought she had won the ultimate victory and that I would be waiting in the lobby to beg for her forgiveness. But I did not walk toward the heavy wooden exit doors. Instead, I walked purposefully toward the back corner of the grand ballroom where the audio and visual control booth was set up. The young technician sitting behind the massive soundboard looked up at me in confusion as I approached. He was wearing a headset and preparing the backing tracks for the church choir performance scheduled for later in the evening. I did not ask for his permission. I reached over his soundboard and pulled the main display cable right out of his laptop. I took the small silver flash drive from my clutch and plugged it directly into the master presentation port. Before the young technician could even process what was happening, I quickly typed in my password and opened the single folder sitting on the drive. I clicked on the first file and hit the presentation button. In an instant, the warm, glowing lights of the ballroom dimmed automatically as the 2 massive projector screens flanking the main stage came to life. The screens were supposed to display peaceful images of doves and crosses during the gala. Instead, they projected a massive high-definition image of an official federal court document. The text was huge and impossible to miss. At the very top of the screen in bold black letters, it read, United States Bankruptcy Court. And right below that, in even larger text, was the name Calvin. The silence in the room was completely shattered. A wave of loud gasps rippled through the hundreds of people seated at their tables. I reached over and picked up the spare wireless microphone resting on the audio technician's desk. I turned it on and my voice boomed clearly through the massive speakers, cutting through the shocked whispers. I told the entire congregation to look very closely at the screens. I instructed the church elders sitting in the front row to pull out their reading glasses and verify the official seal of the federal court. I explained that what they were looking at was the absolute truth about the holy man standing on their stage. I clicked the remote in my hand and the slide changed. Now the massive screens displayed a series of highlighted bank statements and casino debt collections from 4 years ago. The numbers were absolutely staggering. I spoke slowly and clearly, making sure every single syllable echoed perfectly across the quiet room. I explained that 4 years ago, while Deacon Calvin was standing at the pulpit preaching about financial responsibility, he was secretly draining his family savings to pay off massive illegal sports betting and gambling debts. I pointed out the exact dates on the screen showing how he had secretly mortgaged the family home to the absolute limit and then completely defaulted on every single payment while continuing to buy custom-tailored suits to impress the church. I looked toward the stage and watched my father's entire world collapse in real time. Calvin was gripping the edges of the wooden podium so hard his arms were shaking visibly. The proud, wealthy patriarch image he had meticulously crafted for decades was disintegrating right in front of his eyes. He opened his mouth to speak to offer some sort of charismatic excuse, but no words came out. The microphone just picked up his heavy, panicked breathing. Brenda was standing right behind him, staring up at the massive projection screens in absolute horror. The fake tears on her face had completely dried up, replaced by genuine, unadulterated terror. She had spent the last 4 years telling everyone who would listen that her husband was a brilliant financial provider, and now the entire church was looking at undeniable proof that he had nearly left them homeless. I clicked to the next slide. It displayed the official foreclosure notice from the primary lender, complete with the scheduled county auction date from 4 years ago. I spoke into the microphone, my voice echoing with steady, cold authority. I told the congregation that my parents did not lose their home because of a simple misunderstanding or a bad business deal. They lost it because Calvin was a reckless addict who lied to everyone he loved just to maintain an illusion of wealth. I explained that the only reason they did not end up on the street 4 years ago was because the daughter they so openly despised secretly emptied her own savings account to bail them out. I put the final document of the sequence on the screen. It was the original purchase agreement from Apex Holdings, showing the exact dollar amount I had paid in cash to stop the bank auction. I highlighted the date, proving that the shell company my mother had just cried about was actually the very thing that kept a roof over her head. I told the hundreds of people staring at me that I had allowed my parents to live in my house completely rent-free for 4 years, so they could maintain their precious status in this community. I said I had protected their fragile pride and carried their heavy financial burdens while they treated me like I was a complete failure. The reaction from the church community was absolutely devastating for my family. The very same deacons who had been nodding along with Calvin's prayer just minutes earlier were now staring at him with open disgust and shaking their heads. The older women who had been whispering about my lack of respect were now covering their mouths in shock, realizing they had been utterly deceived by Brenda and her fake pearl-wearing persona. Vanessa was sitting at table number 1 looking completely confused and embarrassed as people at the neighboring tables turned to stare at her. Trent was frozen in his chair, sweating through his shirt, realizing that the public destruction of his wealthy father-in-law meant his own financial ruin was totally guaranteed. The entire foundation of their social standing was completely obliterated in a matter of minutes. They were no longer the wealthy, respectable pillars of the church community. They were exposed as massive frauds who relied entirely on the silent charity of the daughter they had just tried to publicly destroy. I stood at the back of the room, holding the microphone and watching the glorious destruction of their carefully built lies, knowing I was only just getting started. I clicked the presentation remote one more time, and the massive screens above the stage shifted to a new set of documents. The congregation leaned in closer, trying to make sense of the glowing text messages and digital screenshots now displayed in front of them. I spoke into the microphone, my voice completely devoid of any sympathy. I told the crowd that the man they all knew as a brilliant financial investor was actually nothing more than a desperate scam artist. I pointed directly at Trent, who was now physically shrinking into his chair at table number 1, trying to hide his face from the hundreds of staring eyes. I explained that the text messages on the screen were downloaded directly from Trent's secret burner phone. I read the messages out loud, making sure everyone in the room heard the pathetic, desperate tone he used when begging his loan sharks for more time. I exposed the fact that his supposed cryptocurrency startup had never generated a single dollar of revenue, and that he had actively borrowed $50,000 from violent criminals to fund his fake wealthy lifestyle. The whispers in the ballroom turned into loud gasps of horror. Older members of the congregation clutched their chests, realizing they had allowed a dangerous con man into their sacred community. I did not stop there. I directed everyone's attention to the specific text messages Trent sent just yesterday afternoon. I read the exact words he typed where he promised his loan sharks that he was manipulating his foolish father-in-law into taking out a massive home equity loan against a fully paid-off property. I explained Trent's master plan to the entire room. I told them he intended to use my parents' house as collateral to steal $300,000 from the bank, pay off his illegal debts, and leave my family to face a second devastating foreclosure while he walked away clean. My father, Calvin, turned his head so fast I thought his neck would snap. He stared at Trent with a look of pure homicidal betrayal. The white savior son-in-law, he had practically worshipped the man he had chosen over his own flesh and blood, had been planning to destroy him entirely. Calvin realized that Trent did not respect him at all and only saw him as a gullible target. Vanessa finally dropped her phone onto the table, her jaw hanging open in absolute shock. The reality that her husband was not a millionaire, but a massive liability who had put their physical safety in danger finally shattered her delusional little world. She looked at Trent, waiting for him to deny it, but he just kept staring at his shoes dripping with cold sweat. The destruction of their fake reality was beautiful to watch, but I had one final devastating piece of evidence to present. I clicked the remote for the last time. The projector screens flashed, and a single crisp document appeared. It was an official banking wire transfer receipt. The amount printed in heavy black ink across the center of the screen was impossible to misread. $2.7 million. The entire ballroom went completely silent again. Even the breathing in the room seemed to stop. The number was so large, it simply did not compute for people who had spent the last hour judging me as a bitter, unemployed failure. I took a deep breath and let my voice carry through the silent room, echoing off the high ceilings and crystal chandeliers. I looked directly at my mother, who was still standing frozen on the stage. I told her I did not serve her with eviction papers because I was feeling petty or vindictive. I said I was not kicking them out just to punish them for their cruelty, although they certainly deserved it. I explained that I was simply conducting a highly profitable business transaction. I told the congregation that the large plot of land my parents were living on had been rezoned for commercial use earlier this year. I announced that I had officially sold the entire property to a luxury commercial real estate developer, and the $2.7 million payment had cleared my corporate bank account just this morning. I looked at my father, Calvin, who was now gripping his chest as if he was having an actual heart attack. I told him that the house he loved so much, the brick colonial he used to make himself feel superior to everyone else, no longer belonged to our family. I said the developer had already secured the demolition permits from the city. I spoke slowly, letting the finality of my words sink into his arrogant mind. I told him the bulldozers were scheduled to arrive on the 1st of next month, and they would reduce his precious legacy to a pile of dust and rubble. I told my family they had exactly 30 days to pack up whatever cheap belongings they actually owned and vacate my property before the wrecking balls arrived. I reminded them that without my financial support and without the house to use as fake collateral, they were finally going to have to live in the reality they had created for themselves. I said I hoped Trent enjoyed his new home office in whatever low-income apartment they could scrape together. The silence that followed my final announcement was heavier than anything I had ever experienced. There was no more judgment directed at me. The congregation was simply in awe of the absolute power shift that had just occurred. They had watched a young woman they underestimated completely dismantle the most arrogant family in their church, using nothing but the cold, hard truth and an undeniable paper trail. I lowered the microphone and placed it gently on the audio technician's desk. I did not wait for a response from the stage or from table number 1. I simply turned around and walked out of the grand ballroom, my heels clicking softly against the marble floor, leaving them all behind in the wreckage of their own making. Even before the heavy wooden doors of the ballroom closed completely behind me, I could hear the absolute explosion of chaos erupting inside. The stunned silence that followed my departure only lasted for a few seconds before the entire room erupted into shouting and angry murmurs. I did not stay to watch the bloodbath, but the young audio technician who was so impressed by my presentation ended up recording the entire aftermath and sending it to me later that night. The audio file was the most satisfying thing I had ever listened to in my entire life. As soon as I was out of sight, Pastor Thomas walked slowly across the stage and picked up the microphone I had left behind. His booming, charismatic voice was gone, replaced by a tone of absolute righteous fury. He looked down at my father, who was still clutching his chest and panting heavily. The pastor did not offer grace, and he did not offer a prayer for my family. He publicly condemned Calvin right there in front of the entire congregation. He told Calvin that using the sacred pulpit to lie to his community and manipulate his own child was an unforgivable sin. He demanded that Calvin step down from his position as a deacon immediately and ordered him to leave the church property forever. Calvin tried to defend himself. His voice cracked as he yelled into the crowd, trying to claim that the documents on the massive projector screens were forged and that I was working with the devil to destroy his good name. But nobody was listening to him anymore. The older men who used to shake his hand and ask for his advice were now turning their backs on him in disgust. The women who used to admire Brenda were now openly mocking her, telling her she was a fraud. Then the villains started turning on each other. Brenda realized that her social standing was completely ruined forever. The fake pearl-wearing persona she had spent decades building was dead, and she desperately needed someone to blame. She turned to Calvin and started hitting his chest with her fists, screaming at him for his secret gambling debts. She wailed that he had humiliated her and destroyed her life. She completely ignored the fact that she was the one who had just stood on stage and lied through her teeth about me to 500 people. She only cared about herself. And now that Calvin could no longer provide the illusion of wealth and power, she looked at him with absolute hatred. While my parents were tearing each other apart in front of the entire church, Trent was silently calculating his own survival. He was still sitting at table number 1, paralyzed by pure terror. The color had completely drained from his face, and his dark fleece vest was soaked with sweat. He knew the $2.7 million was completely out of his reach. He knew the house was gone, and there was absolutely zero equity left to steal. Most importantly, he knew that he had officially missed his Friday deadline with the dangerous loan sharks. He had nothing left to offer them, and he knew they were going to come looking for him to break his legs very soon. Trent looked at his wife Vanessa, who was currently having a massive temper tantrum. She was stomping her feet and screaming at our parents, demanding to know how they were going to buy her the new luxury vehicle they promised her. She was so completely detached from reality that she still thought she was getting a car while her family was being evicted and publicly excommunicated. Trent realized in that exact moment that Vanessa was not a wealthy heiress. She was a spoiled, useless liability who had absolutely nothing to offer him. He did not love her, and he certainly did not want to drag her along while he went on the run from violent criminals. The parasitic bond between them snapped in an instant. While Vanessa was distracted, yelling at Brenda, Trent quietly stood up from the table. He did not say a single word to his wife. He did not say goodbye to his in-laws. He simply turned around and quickly walked toward the back service exit of the grand ballroom, keeping his head down so nobody would notice him leaving. He pushed through the swinging doors into the hotel kitchen and disappeared into the night. He left his car in the parking lot and just ran, leaving Vanessa completely alone to face the wreckage. It took Vanessa about 10 minutes to realize her husband was missing. She stopped yelling at my mother and looked around the empty chairs at table number 1. She started calling Trent's name, assuming he had just gone to the restroom or to the bar to get a drink. When he did not answer, she pulled out her phone and tried to call him, but the line immediately went straight to voicemail. His burner phone was already turned off and thrown into a dumpster somewhere in the city. Vanessa panicked and ran out into the main lobby, her sequined dress sparkling under the harsh hotel lights. She aggressively asked the valet if he had seen a tall white man in a dark fleece vest. The valet looked at her with pity and told her he had seen the man sprinting down the street away from the hotel, looking over his shoulder like he was being chased by a ghost. The reality finally hit her. She was standing in the lobby of a luxury hotel, with no money, no credit cards, no car, and now no husband. The man she had bragged about to all her friends, the supposed financial genius, had abandoned her the second the money dried up. She collapsed onto a velvet lobby sofa and sobbed uncontrollably, realizing she was entirely dependent on parents who were now completely broke and about to be homeless. Back inside the ballroom, the church security team had finally seen enough of the screaming match between Calvin and Brenda. 2 large security guards grabbed my parents by the arms and physically escorted them out of the building. They walked out of the hotel into the cool night air, completely broken and humiliated. They found Vanessa sobbing hysterically in the lobby, and the 3 of them had to cram into Calvin's old squeaky blue sedan to drive back to a house they no longer owned. They were leaving the gala not as respected leaders, but as the biggest disgrace the church had ever seen. Their entire world had collapsed in less than an hour, and there was absolutely nothing they could do to stop it. They were finally reaping exactly what they had sown. The 30-day deadline arrived exactly as promised. It was a hot, humid Tuesday morning, and the sprawling brick colonial house looked completely different. There were no expensive cars parked in the driveway. The white Range Rover was long gone, and the old blue sedan had been sold to a scrapyard just to pay for moving expenses. Instead, a rusted yellow rental truck sat idling on the concrete, leaking a small puddle of dark oil onto the pristine driveway. The beautiful front lawn that my father used to obsess over was already overgrown with thick weeds because the landscaping company had canceled their services weeks ago when the final invoice went unpaid. The neighborhood was completely quiet, but the curtains in the adjacent houses were definitely twitching. The wealthy neighbors that my mother used to invite over for expensive garden parties were now standing in their air-conditioned living rooms, watching the absolute downfall of our family. They watched as Calvin, wearing a stained gray t-shirt and worn-out jeans, struggled to carry a heavy cardboard box down the front steps. He was sweating profusely, and his face was drawn and pale. The arrogant deacon who used to strut around in custom-tailored suits was now reduced to doing his own manual labor because he could not even afford to hire a cheap local moving company. Inside the empty, echoing house, Brenda was frantically trying to wrap her cheap, fake decorative plates in old newspaper. She was crying softly to herself, murmuring about how unfair everything was. The electricity and water had been officially shut off the night before, so the house was suffocatingly hot. She had tried to reach out to her friends from the church hospitality committee, begging them to come help her pack or offer them a temporary place to stay. Every single phone call had gone straight to voicemail. The entire congregation had completely blacklisted them after the truth was revealed at the gala. Brenda was forced to leave behind her heavy velvet curtains and the massive dining room table because the tiny apartment they were moving into simply did not have the square footage to hold her fake luxury lifestyle. Vanessa was sitting on the front porch steps, completely useless. She was wearing dirty sweatpants, and her blonde hair was pulled into a messy knot. She was crying hysterically, wiping her face with the back of her dirty hand, but nobody was comforting her anymore. She had spent the last 30 days waiting for Trent to come back and rescue her, but he was long gone. The local police had actually come to the house twice looking for him regarding unpaid debts and suspected wire fraud, but he had completely vanished without a trace. Vanessa was forced to pack her expensive designer clothes and handbags into cheap black garbage bags, exactly like the ones my father had thrown at my feet just a month earlier. The poetic justice of her packing her entire life into trash bags was absolutely perfect. The reality of their new living situation was crushing them all. They had searched the entire city for a decent place to live, but with Calvin's ruined credit history and zero proof of steady income, their options were incredibly limited. They were forced to sign a month-to-month lease for a cramped two-bedroom apartment in a rundown complex on the far outskirts of the city. The building was known for having stained carpets, flickering hallway lights, and a massive pest control problem. Calvin and Brenda would have to share one small bedroom while Vanessa, the former golden child who demanded a luxury SUV, would have to sleep on a cheap mattress on the floor of the second bedroom. They would have to share a single tiny bathroom and park their rusty rental truck on the street. As Calvin loaded the last black garbage bag into the back of the rented truck, the finality of the situation finally broke him. He stood in the empty driveway looking at the house he had falsely claimed as his legacy for years. His pride was completely gone, replaced by sheer survival panic and absolute regret. He pulled his cell phone out of his pocket with shaking hands. He looked at Brenda and Vanessa, who were standing by the truck looking exhausted and completely defeated by life. Calvin told them he was going to try one last time. He said he was going to call me and beg for my forgiveness. He said he would get on his knees and apologize for every terrible thing he had ever done if I would just let them stay in a hotel for one more week. Brenda nodded desperately, her eyes wide with false hope. Vanessa stopped crying and held her breath, waiting for a miracle from the older sister she used to mock. Calvin dialed my phone number and put the phone on speaker so they could all hear. They stood together in the hot driveway praying for my voice to answer. But they did not hear a ringtone. Instead, a cold, automated voice echoed from the small speaker. The voice announced that the number they were trying to reach had been disconnected and was no longer in service. Calvin stared at the cracked phone screen in absolute disbelief. He hit the redial button again and again, but the automated message repeated every single time, blocking out any hope they had left. I had completely erased them from my life. I had changed my personal phone number, closed my old email accounts, and instructed my corporate legal team to block any communication attempts from them. I did not want their fake, desperate apologies, and I certainly did not want a relationship with people who only valued me for my bank account. The financial and emotional lifeline was permanently severed. Calvin slowly lowered the phone, his shoulders slumping in total defeat. A heavy, miserable silence fell over the three of them. There was no one left to blame, and no one left to manipulate. They silently climbed into the hot, cramped cab of the yellow rental truck. Calvin turned the key and the loud engine roared to life, blowing a cloud of dark smoke. As they slowly backed out of the driveway, a large white commercial truck pulled onto the street parking right in front of the house. Two men in neon vests stepped out carrying large rolls of chain-link fencing and surveying equipment. The demolition crew had arrived exactly on schedule. My family drove away in their rented truck, watching in the side mirrors as the workers began putting up the metal fences around the property, sealing off their old life forever. I did not go to the property to watch the demolition. I did not need to see the physical house torn down, because the emotional fortress my family had built around my life had already been completely leveled. It was exactly 2 weeks after they drove away in that rusted rental truck. I was sitting in my brand new corner office on the top floor of a beautiful downtown high-rise building. The morning sunlight was pouring through the massive floor-to-ceiling glass windows, warming the sleek modern mahogany desk in front of me. My lawyer Rachel was sitting across from me wearing a sharp navy blue suit and a bright, genuine smile. She slid a thick stack of legal documents across the polished wood. This was not a quitclaim deed or an eviction notice. It was the final acquisition paperwork for my supply chain logistics software company. When my father used to scream at me for being lazy and hiding behind my computer screen, he had absolutely no idea what I was actually doing. I was not wasting time. I was quietly building a highly scalable software as a service platform. I coded late into the night while my sister complained about her nails and her luxury vehicle. The corporate job I had lost all those months ago was just a stepping stone, a place where I learned the industry pain points before launching my own solution. The corporate merger we were finalizing today was worth far more than the real estate deal that completely destroyed my family. I picked up my favorite heavy silver pen. It looked exactly like the pen Trent had slammed onto the tablecloth at the church gala when he expected me to surrender my life to him. But this time I was not signing away my power to save ungrateful people. I was signing for my own independent future. I pressed the tip of the pen to the heavy paper and signed my name on the dotted line, officially closing a multi-million-dollar merger that secured my absolute financial freedom for the rest of my life. Rachel congratulated me warmly, packing the signed documents into her leather briefcase and left the office to file the final paperwork. I stood up from my leather chair and walked over to the massive glass windows, looking down at the busy city streets far below. The cars looked like tiny toys moving through the concrete canyons. I took a deep breath of the quiet air-conditioned air. For the first time in my 29 years of life, my shoulders did not ache with the heavy, suffocating burden of carrying parasitic people. I thought about the dark generational trauma that had poisoned my family tree for decades. My parents firmly believed that because they gave me life, I owed them my unconditional financial servitude. They believed that family meant protecting the golden child at the absolute expense of the scapegoat. They demanded blind loyalty, but offered absolutely none in return. I thought about Vanessa waking up this morning on a cheap mattress on the floor of a roach-infested apartment, complaining about the stifling heat because they could not afford to pay the electric bill. I thought about my father Calvin sitting in a cramped living room, stripped of his prestigious deacon title and his fake wealth, forced to confront the harsh reality of his own massive failures. I thought about my mother Brenda, realizing that her superficial church friends never actually cared about her personality. They only cared about the large house I had secretly bought for her. The gossip mill had completely chewed them up and spit them out. And as for Trent, the rumors said he was currently working the night shift at a fast food drive-thru 2 towns over, constantly looking over his shoulder, terrified that the men he owed money to would finally track him down. They had demanded absolutely everything from me, and in the end, they were left with nothing but their own miserable company. I realized, standing there in the sunlight, that my ultimate success did not come from simply working harder or making better investments. My true success only arrived the very moment I stopped trying to purchase the love of people who were completely incapable of loving me. I had spent my entire adult life building a beautiful, comfortable safety net for a family that would gladly push me off a cliff just to see if the net worked. Cutting them off was not an act of petty revenge, it was an act of pure, necessary survival. The day my father threw me out of my own house with black garbage bags was the exact day he set me completely free. He thought he was discarding a failure, but he was actually unleashing a powerhouse. I turned away from the bright window and walked back to my desk, ready to start the next beautiful chapter of my life entirely on my own terms. If you are watching this video right now and you are currently bleeding yourself dry to keep toxic family members comfortable, I need you to listen to me very carefully. You cannot heal in the exact same environment that broke you. You cannot buy the genuine loyalty of people who inherently disrespect your existence. Sharing the same bloodline does not give anyone the right to treat you like a human bank account or an emotional punching bag. Your worth is not defined by how much abuse you can tolerate in the name of family loyalty. Have you ever had to walk away from toxic family members to protect your own peace and sanity? How did you find the incredible strength to finally cut the cord and choose yourself? Please share your personal stories in the comments section below because someone watching this video right now might need the exact courage you have already found. We heal by sharing our truths and exposing the shadows. If my journey resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more authentic stories about resilience, overcoming family trauma, and reclaiming your personal power. Share this video with anyone who needs a strong reminder that walking away from dead weight is the ultimate form of self-care. Thank you so much for listening to my story and spending your time with me today. Always remember that the family you build around you with strong boundaries and mutual respect will always be stronger than the family that demands your endless sacrifice without ever offering their love.